Hello everyone, hopefully you guys can hear me. Welcome to another exciting episode of Insect-Inspired Creature Design. And I'm of course Eric Keller, and I do my Wednesday nights ZBrushing all about bugs. So, make sure I have the chat visible and we'll get started. So, as I've been doing for the past few sessions, I want to start with just a brief discussion of some of the things that I've learned about insect anatomy over the years. I'm a perpetual student, so I don't pretend to know everything. But I do want to share some of the things I've learned because it can kind of help you make better insects or insect-inspired design. So let's start with one of my favorites, which is, of course, a dragonfly. And this is a dragonfly model they made a while back. The common name of this particular dragonfly is a Halloween pennant dragonfly. And of course, these have some of the most amazing wings. They're also kind of, in evolutionary terms, some of the oldest wings, because the first flying insects were very close to what we see in modern dragonflies. I think one of the first one is Meganura, which had like a wingspan of like 3 feet or something like that. Just insane. Anyways, but this particular dragonfly, I want you to notice a few things that are really important. And then first is the three-dimensional shape of the wing itself. You see how it's corrugated like this, right? These are not just flat like window panes. You know, a dragonfly wing looks a lot like stained glass, which is one of the things that makes it look so incredibly beautiful. But I see a lot of creature designers, when they do something that's sort of inspired by dragonfly wings, they make them completely flat. And not only does that make the design boring, it's also kind of incorrect for some very important reasons. Because this shape, this corrugated shape of the dragonfly wing, has a lot to do with the physics of its ability to fly. So dragonflies are famous for being incredibly, let's say, acrobatic. They can turn basically 180 degrees within a few beats of their wings, and of course they can hover. They're very famous for their hovering ability. And a lot of this is due to the fact of the shape of this wing. So, and what I mean by that is I was reading some papers by some engineers who were inspired by biological design, and they were looking at this corrugated shape of the wings and how it behaves with the air. So when these wings are flapping up and down, what happens is, rather than just like pushing the air down and lifting the bug up, which is what we commonly think of insect flight as being like, but it's nothing like that in reality. What happens is, as the dragonfly flaps its wings, or the way that it flaps its wings, creates these vortices of airs. So remember that air is a fluid, dynamic thing. Just because it's not water doesn't make it not a fluid. It's a fluid. And so it behaves in many of the same ways that we commonly think of liquids doing, but it's just at a much different density. So these wings are flapping up and down. It's creating these little vortices, and these vortices act almost like ball bearings in a way. So think of a dragonfly when it's flying through the air as kind of rolling through the air because of the way that this wing is designed. And you can look up some really cool slow motion videos online of dragonfly wings of flight. It's always a good idea to watch like slow motion or high speed photography of insects, because getting to a sense of how they behave in motion gives you a lot of clues to how their bodies actually work. So very cool design, and I think when I see especially a lot of fantasy characters, when they make fairies, they make the wings kind of very flat and boring. And I think by adding some of this three-dimensional shape to the wing, not only do you make it a bit more anatomically accurate, you also make it more interesting when the light catches it, right? Because if it's just a flat surface, then light is going to reflect off of it in a very dull kind of way. It's going to look like a windshield of a car. When you actually have some three-dimensional shape to it, then as the camera moves around the object, or as the object pivots, you're going to get that change in reflection, and that's going to make things much more visually interesting. So if I switch to like a metallic metal, you can kind of see how those highlights change as we change the view of the model, right? So it's something important to keep in mind. So let's take a look. Well, actually, I want to do one more thing. It's like dragonflies are a great subject to model accurately if you're trying to understand insect anatomy. Their muscles are much more exposed than the muscles on a lot of other insects. You notice that these don't necessarily go into the body the same way that you'd see on like a wasp or a bee. They're kind of like on top, and they've got these other parts, these shapes right here, which kind of like holds the muscles in place. And so let's take a look at some other insects. These are dense models, so they take a few seconds to shift here. So here's another model, and this is a damselfly. And a lot of times people mistake damselflies for dragonflies because they look very similar, right? They are closely related. They're in the same order, which is Odonata, but they're not exactly the same. You can see that this damselfly, again, it has 4 wings, a front wing and a hind wing on either side, and it also has this same 3-dimensional shape to it. In this case, it's even more pronounced than the dragonfly model. This is a ebony jewel wing dragonfly, or what is this, the Latin name, C. maculata. One of the important distinctions of dragonflies and damselflies is that damselflies are actually able to fold their wings back like this. Dragonflies, with their rest, their wings are always flat out in that typical shape. Whereas damselfly wings, they're actually drawn back like this. So that's a huge difference. And you can also see that the muscles are kind of exposed or more visible, I should say, than a typical insect. But you can sort of see the inside there. I mean, there's a lot of great inspiration here in these various pieces that make up the thorax, especially around the wings. It's something that I'm still studying and learning a lot about. But that is a damselfly, very similar to a dragonfly, but not exactly the same thing. And again, a great source of inspiration for 3-dimensional shaped of insect wings. So let's take a look at another. This would be seen. So let's take a look at this. Okay, so this is the Vespa mandarinia. This is the Japanese giant hornet. And this has got more of what we kind of consider typical insect wing, or at least as far as we understand. And you can see they actually kind of go into the body here, into this opening in the body. So they're not resting on top like a dragonfly wing. They do have a 3-dimensional shape to them, but they're very different than the dragonfly. You don't have that dense sort of corrugation of the shape. Instead, you have kind of these cells. These sort of larger cells that you see typical in insect wings. Another thing I want to point out is, since this is a wasp, it's in the order of Hymenoptera, and Hymenoptera, basically the insects that fall within this order, have 4 wings, 2 sets of 2 wings, a front wing and a hind wing. You'll notice the hind wing is significantly smaller than the front wing, and I don't have it in this model, but with Hymenoptera you'll get kind of a little like hooks along the edge of the front edge of the hind wing and the back edge of the front wing, and these hooks kind of work like Velcro, so they sort of attach the wings together so that when it's in flight it behaves like one big wing. So it's going to fly very differently than a dragonfly wing, right? Dragonfly wings are going to be like an opposing pair. It's kind of like this when they're flying, right? I can see that like this. Whereas Hymenoptera, the wings are going to kind of attach and then behave as like one wing. And then when it's not in flight, it can detach the wings and kind of fold them. And you'll also see that in a lot of wasps, the wing itself will kind of fold like a taco. So they kind of fold in half there, which is a very difficult thing to model. But that's some differences between a kind of a typical wasp wing and, say, dragonfly wing. And you'll notice that in this case, and also the other models, that the way I tend to do it, not for everything, but oftentimes, I will model the wing veins separately from the wing membrane itself. And that's something I'm going to talk about tonight as we design our wasp, or as I continue to design the wasp we've been working on. You'll see my techniques for doing this. And it's something that I've worked on over years. You know, when you're rigging and animating these things, yeah, the wing veins are going to be fairly dense, but they're not too bad. And I've been able to come up with some rigs that make it not too hard to actually animate. And it's, you know, it's not too dense. But I like to have them separately because if I'm designing a shader, I like to have one shader that is transparent for the wing membrane and another one that is for the wing veining. And because they're made of two different materials. I mean, they're attached in the same piece, of course, in the real thing, but I think it's easier to use two different materials, and I find it looks more realistic. And a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, my wings will actually be a single-sided surface. So in other words, if I go down here under display properties and turn off double, you'll see that it's one-sided. You also notice that I do sculpt a fair amount of details. These little pores right here, you'll typically see when you close up on insect wings. And you know, the wing veins do several things. They provide structure, and I do believe they bring circulation. In other words, insects, for their blood, it's called hemolymph. It's not the same thing as blood, but it provides the same function, which is to distribute oxygen throughout the system. And I believe that the wing veins will have some hemolymph transport within them, but I could be wrong about that, but I believe that is correct. So they keep the wing cells alive. I mean, these things don't have to live for very long, so it doesn't have to be that sophisticated a system, but that is one of the things that wing veins do. So let's take a look at something else. And in all of these things that I'm bringing up, I kind of want to give to you as a source of inspiration as you design your own insects. Here, of course, is a butterfly. This is a painted lady butterfly. And actually, I do have a poly paint on this. If I turn on poly paint, you'll see I have created a pattern on here. I'll switch over to a white material so you can see a little bit better. And this is a case where I actually did keep the wing veins and the wing membrane as a single surface. So this does not have separate veins. Why I did that on this model, I can't quite remember. I think it's mainly because this model is a very, very fuzzy butterfly, and I knew I was going to have the whole thing kind of covered in hair. In this case, I used Yeti. But so you can kind of see, and this is also, in this case, it's the surface of the wing actually does have thickness. So I have double-sided off, but you can see that it does have two sides to it. And a lot of times for butterflies, an important thing, here's something that I often see as a mistake, especially with particular butterflies. Maybe not in the case of this one. Well, actually in the case of this one, it's true. Notice that the pattern on the top and the pattern on the bottom are different, right? So if I turn solo, there's the bottom of the butterfly wing and there's the top. And you have things like eye spots, which are often there that have the advantage of fooling potential predators into thinking it's a much larger, scarier organism. That's very common among insects. I see a lot of times with blue morpho butterflies, and I think this is an important enough point that I want to actually bring up some reference here, since I'm lecturing the hell out of y'all. Because I see this mistake all the time. It's a telltale sign of a CG bug and also a lazy artist. Okay, so let's take a look at a blue morpho. It has these beautiful blue colors and eye spots right here that you can see. Very typical. But take a look over here. We have a blue morpho, has a totally different looking wing. It's not this beautiful iridescent blue. It's this with a whole bunch of eye spots on it and brown color. Well, it's a perfect example right here of very, very different designs on one side of the wing as opposed to the other. So you have blue on one side and you have brown with this design on the other. And that has a very important function, because if you're a predator and you see this blue, bright shiny blue thing and it flies away and all of a sudden you're getting a kind of confusion because you're seeing blue and brown, or maybe you're seeing it from underneath and it looks like it just disappears because you're looking for that blue. That's one of the advantages of this type of this organization of colors on the wings. So, it's kind of teleological to say that that's why it evolved that way, but this is the advantage of having it in this particular arrangement. So a lot of times I'll see, like in commercials where I've worked on enough commercials to know what happens. The art director says, I want a butterfly for my commercial. They'll look around online, they'll say, oh, this one's beautiful, it's blue, let's make this one. And so the artist goes ahead, makes a beautiful blue butterfly, and then on both sides of the wing paints the same blue design, and forgets to check out the fact that the underside is actually a completely different color and a completely different design. So it's a great way to spot a CG butterfly if both of the sides of the wings are the same color. And like I say, it's laziness. It's a bit disappointing because I think this is actually the most interesting thing about this butterfly, is the fact that the top and the bottom are so different. Okay, so enough pontification on that. I do want to point out another thing about butterfly wings and moth wings, is that if you zoom in really close, you can see I have sculpted this scale pattern. So butterfly wings are covered in tiny scales, and those scales have pigments which give the butterfly its design, its colored design. And again, it's tough to say, what is the advantage of having these scales? For one thing, it probably makes the flight a bit more quieter. You're not going to get buzzing. Of course, these are much bigger wings, so they're not going to flap enough to give you a buzzing sound. But I've also heard it speculated that, butterflies, when they get caught in like a spider web, because these things are so big that it's very easy for them to fly right into a spider web, having the sticky spider web attached to these scales, which are easily removed, means that the butterfly can get free from the spider web a little bit easier, because the web will stick to those scales and the butterfly will be able to free itself, just leave behind a few scales and get away. So that's one idea for why the scales might be advantageous. But there's a lot of cool videos online that kind of show you like super microscopic images of the scales, and you can see how that iridescent in the butterflies that are iridescent, how that comes about. So that's kind of a cool thing to pay attention to. And if you're sculpting a butterfly and you want to do a close-up, remember to put those scales in there, because that's also, again, when you throw shaders on it, when you throw lighting on it, it's going to make the wing look much more interesting than just kind of a flat, boring wing. And you'll also notice that this does have a three-dimensional shape to it, just like, not quite as dense as the dragonfly wing, but it still has that kind of nice shape, and I think that's important to have. Yeah, a lot of times when I'm doing renders, I'll do an ambient occlusion pass, and it's always fun to look at them to see how they look, especially with these guys. With this particular one, I'll show you on my portfolio, just because, well, I'm going to plug myself. What the heck, why not? That's why I'm doing this, right? I do have some renders that I did in this one in Yeti, in Redshift, using Yeti for the fur, because this one is super furry, not just on the body but also on the wings itself. And again, that's something I think that's really important to see. Sorry, I'm looking through my portfolio, see if I can find it real quick. Here it is. If you go to my website, lupitone.com, right here, you can see these things. So this is my renders in Redshift of this particular butterfly. So you can see I actually use the colors, the textures, to kind of color the fur in Yeti as well. And I like Yeti just because I find it very easy to groom. So you can see how dense the fur is on this particular butterfly. So it's not just scales, it's also hairs. So this is a painted lady. So you can see kind of the setup there. I don't know if I have any ambient occlusion renders on here. I'll try and post some when I get a chance, but you can see sort of the setup there. in ZBrush, the poly painting, which I used for the painting of the hairs as well. So another thing, another important point, insects are fuzzy. Don't forget to make your bugs fuzzy. It adds an awful lot of realism to them, you know. And if you're just doing a still image, of course, you could do it using like fiber mesh and ZBrush, or whatever hair system you like. That's butterfly wings. Let's take a look at... And of course, you know, there's so much... I'm just covering a few different types of insects here, but there's many, many more to be covered. So I just want to give you the idea, the concept that not all insect wings are the same. So here is a fly. This is not a house fly. This is C. atra. I made this based on scan data. And here's the important thing about flies. Flies are in the order Diptera, and this basically refers to the fact that they have two wings as opposed to all the other insects that I've shown tonight. Butterfly, dragonfly, damselfly, a wasp, all have 4 wings, but flies have evolved to have 2 wings. They basically, their hind wings have kind of diminished in importance and in size to the point where they end up just being these little nubs that we call halteres. So let me select this and I'll turn on transparency so you can see. Let me get a ghost transparency. So you see these little nubs here? This is the remnants of the hind wings. So it's not quite vestigial because these are called halteres, Haltere, and this is what you'll find in a fly instead of hind wings. And this is what's interesting is these things, it's believed that they have kind of a gyroscopic kind of quality to them. In other words, flies are so annoyingly agile, and if you've ever tried to kill a mosquito or get rid of a housefly, you can see this. Mosquitoes are also in Diptera, by the way. So you can see this, that they're really, really acrobatic, and they're really, really hard to kill and capture in flight. And it's believed it's because these halteres give them kind of a way to really kind of sense their surroundings in the air. So maybe they've lost some function in terms of what the hind wings would give another type of insect, but they've also gained a function in that you have this kind of gyroscopic quality to them. This particular fly also has this weird type of flap that you'll see on some flies here. And I'm not exactly sure what this is all about. This is based on scan data, but you'll see this on a lot of flies. So I have to ask some of my fly expert friends. And yeah, I have many friends who are just experts just in flies, so I really need to talk to them about this, like what this does and how this affects the flight of the fly. But another interesting things about fly wings is you'll often see, if I just take the thorax here, I don't know if the wings are properly in place here. I think they are. This opening needs a little bit of work here. But a lot of times you'll see like a little nub underneath the bottom of the wing. So what you want to think about is, you have a plank of wood, right? That's moving up and down, right? And let's say that it's a flexible plank of wood, right? So I can move it up and down like this, right? And so my wrist now is expending a certain amount of energy to move it up and down, right? So now think of that plank of wood and think about if there was something right here that stopped it from going all the way down. Well, if it's a flexible piece, what would happen? You'd have this, a bend and then a flap up like that, right? It's almost like a springboard action. So a lot of flies a lot of flies, I think other insects as well, but I know that some flies have this little piece of, the thorax that stops it, actually gives them an advantage because now they're using less energy to flap up and down, right? You're flapping down, and then you have the springboard action that's kind of helping it flap back up again, right? So you're using less energy to move the wing up and down, which gives you more power, less energy. That's always an advantage, right? So that's something you can think about when you're designing, especially the way that the wings behave. And of course, insect wings, there's this common misconception that way back when somebody thought, hey, bumblebees are aerodynamically impossible, they shouldn't be able to fly. Well, the knucklehead who came up with that idea was not taking into account the scale of the insect and how much differently the density of air behaves when you're at a smaller scale. When you're at a smaller scale, air starts to behave a lot more like a liquid water. So in that case, aerodynamics are very different. And so you're having, you don't necessarily have just a straight up and down kind of motion like this when you're flying. I hope you guys have the volume on, because otherwise I'm going to look like a knucklehead doing this. A lot of times what you have is more of a swimming motion with your wings. So if you look at slow motion footage of bees and flies, you're going to see this kind of swimming kind of quality to them as they're going through the air. So that's something also that you want to think about when you're designing or animating bees, that it's not a straight up and down thing. It's more of a swimming thing. And so you have all these things are working together, whether it's that kind of like I'm mentioning, that kind of springboard thing that you see in some insect wings. You have the swimming thing, you have the corrugation. All these things have an influence. And this is also why different insects have very different personalities when they fly, right? So it's their motion has a personality to them. So if you watch a beetle fly, like a good one is like a fig beetle, which are those bright green beetles that you'll see. They're really clumsy. They come around in the spring here in Los Angeles, and they just look ridiculous as they're flying through the air, because they buzz really loudly. That's very different than a bee that has kind of a swimmy kind of a hovering, but it's like not a static hovering, right? Bees are kind of like this when they hover, or even just a little bit, as opposed to a dragonfly, which hovers like this, right? So all these different insects have a different quality to them. And you look at hoverflies, just the way that they move. So again, it's a creature designer. These are things that you want to draw from when you're creating your bugs. Yeah, I know. I've actually been sculpting a spider before, and a similar spider will like crawl across my Cintiq while I'm sculpting, and it's like a jumping spider or something like that. So basically, insects swim in the air. Exactly, that's the best way to put it. There's a really cool book called Air and Water. It's really, really dense, heavy-duty physics. It's way beyond my feeble mind to comprehend, because it gets into mathematics of like the Reynolds number and all this kind of stuff that you would only hear about if you're a real fluid dynamics nerd. In which case you're probably watching a Houdini live stream right now. But this book, Air and Water, is really cool because it talks about sort of the density of fluids and how they influence evolutionary designs or designs in nature. It's like, why don't we have any animals that behave like hot air balloons or zeppelins? Well, we do. They're called sperm whales. It's just because of the density of that animal, they live in the water. The density required to live in air and be buoyant in air would be, well, like a hot air balloon. That's kind of hard for a living organism to do. So I think those are the examples that I want to show today before we get into some actual sculpting. So let's do that, and let's take a look at where we left off last time. So last time I was doing the legs, which admittedly was a bit of a boring lecture and kind of repetitive. And there's some refinement I want to do on these legs still. I'm not totally happy with them. I might do that offline just because it was a bit of a tedious sculpt, and I don't want to subject you guys to that. So when I designed the thorax to this guy, wasn't really considering wing position beyond the fact that I know I want to have two openings, one's for the front wing and one for the hind wing. But looking at it now, I realize that the hind wing is probably going to have some trouble because of this. So as I add the wings in here, I'm going to probably have to revisit my design and see if I need to change something in order to make it more believable as it flies. So usually when I start out, if I'm doing a realistic insect and I don't have access to scan data, I will spend a lot of time looking up like the wing veining for that particular insect, because wing veins are one of the telltale features of a particular species. And if you get it wrong, the entomologists get upset. In this case, we're going to make up our own wing vein. And I'm going to, since this is wasp, I'm going to keep it wasp-like, but maybe let's play with it a little bit and see what we can get away with, since we're inventing our own thing. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sculpt the basic design of the wing membrane itself, and then I'll derive the wing vein pattern from that. Have I ever used Houdini procedural stuff simulation? I've taken some Houdini classes at Noman way back when. You know, I've done dynamic stuff in Maya. I've used MASH. I've used Cinema 4D a little bit. I really like Houdini. It's just, for me, it's like a foreign language. I just don't have enough time to really devote to it to get good at it, but I do really like it, and I think it's awesome. I mean, Substance Designer. I love procedural stuff. I mean, you know, there's procedural stuff in Maya. It's just not nearly as robust as what you would find. Not even close to being as robust as what you'd find in Houdini. But Houdini is really, really cool. It used to be very opaque software. Like, you could only learn Houdini from another Houdini user. So that was like back in the days of like Houdini 8. And then when they switched over to Houdini 9 and 10, they completely overhauled the interface. And they also spent a lot of time working on the instruction materials, coming up with free version. I think they did a lot of stuff right in order to make it a more viable and useful program. And it paid off because, you know, if you're doing any kind of serious dynamics, then, you know, you should really be using Houdini. Maya will get you up to a certain point. Even Bifrost is kind of like their version of Houdini, but it's just not the same. So I'm going to append a star here. Procedural modeling, I've done a little bit, you know, but you can see I'm a sculptor at heart, so I tend to use more procedural, you know, maybe some stuff in Unreal I've played around with, which I hope to do more. So I'm going to start with a polyplane here, and let's make sure, first of all, I'm going to put on double so we can see both sides here. And let's rotate it. And let's do it one more time. Let's rotate it 90 degrees. So I'm going to make it flat up and down. It's double-sided. Let's take a look at the polyframe. So maybe I'll increase the density a little bit. We don't have to go too crazy. Just a nice little grid, something like that. And what I might do, there's lots of different ways to go about doing this, as you'll see. So, you know what I might do? Actually, I've changed my mind. I'm going back. I'm going to not use a plane. I'm going to use a sphere. And I'm going to flatten this sphere, and I'm going to just focus first on the shape of the wing and not worry about topology or any of that. But I want to use a slight thickness so that I can turn on Dynamesh, basically, or, you know, Sculptress. Either one works easier with a surface that has thickness to it. So let's Dynamesh this sucker. That's probably a little too much. Let's do something like this. It's good. And I'm going to get my move brush, and I'm going to start shaping the sucker. No, I will show you. I animate my insects all the time. I rig and animate them. What I'm doing, though, you have to do is I'm creating the concept version of the model, and eventually, after I have the concept version, I will retopologize it and bring it down to a level of density that is usable. And then I'll use projection and displacement maps and other types of texture maps to do the rigging, right? Which is, you know, that's not unusual. That's kind of traditional. That's kind of traditional way to do things. But I have, you know, I've animated bees, and I've animated my dragonfly, actually. And if you go to Entomology Animated, I do have that dragonfly model flying in my lecture on insect vision. So let's take a look at how we want to do our wasp wing. Now, right now I'm just playing with ideas, but since this is kind of meant to be informed design, let's take a look at some reference before we get too crazy. specifically of wasps. I want to get just crazy enough, right? So let's see if we can have some wasp wings. I got some wasps over here, but I can't really see their wings very well. So it's off to the, well, here we go. And this is, whoops. This is a kind of a typical wasp-bee kind of figuration, right? Kind of straight right here, and then a curve, maybe a dent, and then another one, and then the hind wing much smaller. So I'm going to keep this side a little bit straighter. This side maybe a little bit more like this, but since we can be creative with this, let's get some transparency going. Yeah, I'm reticent about kit bashing nature, but you could, yeah, I mean, you could also create an insert mesh brush of insect parts if you wanted to throw them together, or you could do procedural modeling. I mean, I'm not against procedural modeling, but it's just like, as an artist, this is my preferred way of doing things, especially if I'm doing something that's supposed to be scientifically accurate. Then, you know, I don't want to be putting dragonfly wings on a wasp, you know what I mean? But yeah, I mean, it depends on, you could create a modular system for, let's say you wanted to create a forest of alien bugs and you only had a limited time and you had to create like 100 different types of bugs, then a modular system in Houdini would be a really cool way to go about doing it. Again, if you're doing like an alien planet, then you can kind of do what you want. But you could use some of the principles that I'm talking about in your design of your modular sections of an insect. So if you look at my previous live streams where I talk about each different parts of the bug, use that as a inspiration for creating your modular designs. So I'm kind of having a little bit of fun with this here, playing with some angles, because I don't want to make it boring. You know, I don't want to be trapped so much by being accurate that I lose an opportunity to be creative. If this is Hymenoptera, though, I think I want to have this a little bit more straight on the bottom like this, so that the hook's going to kind of connect. And I might do something like this. If you look at like mud dauber wasps, a lot of these other wasps, like I mentioned before, they actually fold their front wings. If I take SK cloth, right? They have like they fold like along the line that goes down the middle of the wing, kind of like a taco. It's really hard to model it and rig correctly unless you've done it I've only done it a few times, but it's something to notice about wasps, because you'll notice when they're resting on the ground, their wings look really, really thin. Yeah, I have a tarantula hawk wasp. I don't know if you can see it, but I have it up on my wall. Right up there. The first Gnomon video series I did on insect design, I used a tarantula hawk wasp as inspiration. I've been out in the field taking pictures of bugs with my entomology friends, and oh yeah, let's look at the whole thing here. And I was in the Anza-Borrego Desert, which is a really cool place to go. And we were at a tree. There was probably 5 or 6 tarantula hawk wasps just buzzing around. And they are extremely painful. Their sting is the second most painful sting in the insect kingdom, according to Justin O. Schmidt in his famous catalog of insect stings. But they're not necessarily aggressive to people. So I'm going to take a look at this right here. I might want to have this straight like this. So turn off transparency and let's take a look at the silhouette here. And I'm also going to do a mirror and weld across the x-axis. So that's a kind of a nice silhouette right there. What I like about it is kind of sort of calling back the head design, a lot of these slopes into the insect wing itself, the front wings. I might make these a little bit thinner so that I can fit the hind wing underneath. So this is a good time to kind of just look at that silhouette. Maybe make this a little bit pointier at the end. So now I'm using my creature design brain as opposed to my entomology brain. You know, if you're doing a design for a director, it's like Avatar or something like that. Obviously, James Cameron is somebody who's very interested in actual insect anatomy and evolution, but also at the end of the day, you got to make it look cool. You got to keep the audience engaged. So there's always that kind of interplay, which I think is the most interesting thing about in creature design, between keeping something believable, plausible, but also looking cool. You know, form follows function, but also everything follows what the director wants. You know, and at the end of the day, that's your job as an insect creature designer. Oops, I kind of messed up here. You can see I forgot to turn symmetry on, so I'm going to do mirror and weld. And now I'm going to hit X for symmetry. There we go. So I like where that's going. I feel like there's a consistency in the design there between the head, the thorax, and the shape of the wings. Bullet ants are number 1. Tarantula hawk is number 2, according to Justin O. Schmidt, who has the most hysterical name for that kind of thing, because I think it was like O. Schmidt that hurts, you know. Okay, so let's see. So to make the hind wings, I'm going to cheat a little bit, and let's just duplicate this. And turn on transparency, get our gizmo out, and shrinky dink. Let's bring this down like this. And then use our ZBrush to kind of shape this. You have this similar, but not necessarily exactly the same. I've heard the most painful venom is rattlesnake venom, in terms of just sheer pain. I don't know how long people have been bit by cobras are around to actually tell you how painful it is, but rattlesnake venom is supposed to be unbelievably painful. So in all those old Western cowboy movies where the guy's like just gritting his teeth, oh, I just got bit by a rattlesnake, he should be screaming for bloody murder and passed out or something like that. At least that's what I've heard. I like the way these join up, but it's a little bit too bent right here, I think, to look like a good structure, but I kind of like this right here. I think I'm going to take some more artistic liberty on the insect veining, the wing veining. Let's pretend we're on a different planet that has a different density to its atmosphere. So maybe it needs more veins. Maybe it needs more of a three-dimensional shape. I don't know. Kind of like that. This is like almost has like a butterfly-like quality to it. So we're departing a little bit from wasp, but I like that. I mean, you could see that there's plenty of insects that mimic the look of other insects, so why not? We can use it. Batesian mimicry, right? I like that silhouette. So let's save. Save next. Take a sip of beer. And maybe we won't have to change our thorax design. Who knows? We'll see. Well, we had to move this down a bit so it fits in there. So let's do this. Turn transparency again and see if we can keep that same idea, but make this fit a bit better. And then once I get this sorted out, I'll go on to the next phase, which is making a single-sided surface. The wing muscles, in terms of their anatomy, is still a bit of a mystery to me. It's kind of hard to sort them out, even if you have one under a microscope. It looks like a whole lot of just a huge mess. So it's something that I'm still practicing. So I'm not going to get too far into that tonight. I'll sculpt some wing muscles, but that's probably where my accuracy is going to fail a little bit. Artistic interpretation is going to take over. Okay. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so let's go up here and turn on polyframe, and then what I'm going to do is let's make this smaller. And I'm going to, let's do solo, and I'm going to do a polygroup from the top. I'll show you why in just a second. It's going to do polygroup, group, front. Alright, so I have one polygroup for the bottom, one polygroup for the top. And now what I can do is I'm going to use ZRemesher with the polygroup function on. Oops. So we'll go down here to geometry, ZRemesh, keep groups. And let's try setting this to, I don't know, 50,000, so that'll be 50 for the target polygon count. And see what that gets us. So the nice thing about the polygroups is they've kind of given us a nice, not perfect, but a decent edge flow along the edges here. Let's do another one. Let's set this to half. Do a few more times and get it. I think I had it better this time, because what I want is I want an edge loop that goes all the way around the outer edge. And one way you can test this is if I go to ZModeler and try and insert an edge loop. So you can see that's not perfect because it's not going just around the edge. So what we could do, what I'm doing is everything I can to avoid having to do a hand retopo of this. I could do it, you know, it's not the end of the world, but right now I'm trying to be as lazy as possible. So there's another thing we can do about this. We can, first of all, I'm going to Control-Shift-Click on this once and again to hide it. Now I have a single-sided surface, and I'm going to go in here and say Modify Topology, Delete Hidden. So now, like if I turn off double-sided, hello, display properties, double, you can see the back faces are invisible. So this is a single-sided surface. And now what I can do, well, one easy way to create an edge loop that goes all the way around is to use our ZModeler on this outer edge. I'm going to hover over an edge and I'm going to choose extrude, and I'll choose, we could do mesh loop or edge, mesh border or edge loop. Let's do mesh border and pull that out. And that's giving us an edge loop that goes all the way around. It's a little hard to tell right here because we got a bump on it, right? Whoops. Got some triangles there that are kind of ugly, so let's undo that real quick. Another thing we can do is, let's try that again, but instead of mesh border, let's do edge loop. I'm still getting triangles. So another way you can go about doing this is under edge loop. I'm going to do group loops, and I'm going to set this down to like 1. And what that does is it does kind of like what a ZRemesh does. In other words, it's reorganized the topology, but it's inserted a new polygroup along the edge of the border of the polygroup, which means I have this purple polygroup that goes all the way around, keeping the shape of the wing pretty well, but also giving me a bit nicer topology to work with. So just some tricks that you can do to kind of force the topology if you don't really feel like doing a hand retopology. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to flatten this a bit. We'll sculpt in a three-dimensional surface later, but I want to get rid of the shape that we got from that using a sphere. So just flatten this with the gizmo, and maybe what I'll do is I'm going to do Control-Shift-Click. Whoops. Let's do Q. Let's go to Move. I'm going to do Control-Shift-Click on this border. Just mask it real quick. And then use a smooth brush just to smooth the edges here. Bring that inside in a little bit so I have a little bit more space. All things that will just make it a little bit easier to work with as I start sculpting on this thing. Okay, a nice looking wing there so far. You know, it's made up pretty much of evenly spaced quads for the most part. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to subdivide it, and I'm going to start designing my wing veining using polypaint. But I'm also going to save once this finishes auto-saving the project. It's a big project because I got all these other bugs in here. Okay, come on, hurry up. Let me see if I can think of other interesting wing facts. I mentioned before, if you see an ant and an ant has wings, that ant is either the queen or it's a male. Worker ants do not have wings. Worker ants are sterile females, and they've lost their ability to fly. Ants actually evolved from wasps, so they evolved from flying insects. They are in Hymenoptera, so the ants that do have wings will have the two pairs of wings, and they will join with that sort of Velcro kind of thing, just like wasp wings do. Male ants are incredibly dumb because they only have half the chromosomes of their sisters. Male ants come from unfertilized eggs, so they have 100% of the genetic information of their queen. So the male ants tend to be really dumb. So bad news for Ant-Man. Controlling them, one hand might be very easy because they're dumb, but on the other hand, they're very dumb, so they probably fly into walls and stuff like that. So, sorry, Ant-Man. I think it's a bad strategy to use male ants. Also, male ants are mostly interested in mating with the queen. They're probably not interested in anything else. So again, Ant-Man's going to have a hard time using them for anything useful. Sorry, Mr. Paul Rudd. Okay, let's divide the sucker a few times. Get it up to, let's say, 3 million is plenty. I just want enough that I can start drawing on this. And let's take a quick look at some reference real quick. Quick. Bring up my pure ref over here. So you can kind of see typical vein. You might have a slight gap here. You have like one vein that goes along this outer edge, and then a second with a little bit of a gap. It looks like it's kind of reinforcement, and then you have these kind of cells in here that kind of form this pattern. Longer cells down here, more ovoid or square or rectangular cells up here. So let's kind of stick with that idea, but let's also have a little bit of fun with it. And so I'm going to switch to my paint tool, P for paint, and we're going to polypaint this sucker. So let's go in here, find that subtool, turn on polypaint. I'm going to switch, so I'm painting with black. I'm going to press O for the hotkey so I can bring up the focal shift and turn it all the way down to -0, so that, sorry, -100, so that I have a nice pencil-like line. And maybe bring this down a little bit. Go into stroke. Lazy mouse is on. I'm going to turn up a lazy radius. Let's try Lucky 13 and see how that goes. That's not bad. So this is where the wing muscles are going to be. So I'm just going to shade this in real quickly in black. And let's do let's also go in here and set my document background to get rid of the gradient. And let's do document. I want to be able to see my black lines there. Okay, so let's do something like this. Have it fade out like that. And then I want to do something kind of like this. Trying to around here. I'm going to have them join, form a thick part. Like this. And then I'll have this vein come around all the way to about here and then fade out and get thinner. So you don't have a wing vein on the back side of the wings usually. Usually they come in many insects, they come to about the tip and then they kind of stop. I'm going to hold the Alt key, so it's going to switch to a white color, so I can kind of use that as an eraser right here, just to make this a bit thinner. All right, okay, so there's my, make this a bit thicker right here. Here's sort of my main structure for the beginning of the wing veining here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to have this split off. Up here, let's do something like this. So I'm looking at my reference for some inspiration here, but we want to create some branching structures and something like this. I'm being a little bit too true to form here, so maybe let's get a little bit creative here. I was working on a model of an aphid, and they have, very different wing veinings. It's a little bit simpler. So I'm just going to create, I don't know, something like this. And a lot of entomologists will have, names for each one of these cells. Kind of like that. Let's start off the back of the wing here, but then kind of fade out, do something like this. I'm going to have the joint up here, but I think that's kind of boring. I'm going to have it do something like this, and then kind of fade out like that. And then maybe something like that. I don't know. I can do this, maybe make this look a little bit more interesting. I don't like that. Something like that. Okay. Let me just put a few little curves in here just to make it look a bit more interesting. So, kind of a motif here. It's like stained glass or something. So I kind of have an echo in the design here. So maybe one more right there. So again, kind of thinking in creature design terms, thinking about setting up a rhythm. It's kind of cool. So now that we have that, I'm going to go in here and just fill in this area right here with black. And you'll see why in just a second. So if I was doing a realistic or actual anatomical diagram, what I would do is I would actually bring in a diagram of the wing vein, whether it's something I painted in Photoshop based on reference or just a photo or a diagram that you found in a text, bring it into ZBrush, and you could project it on here, or you could just put it in the background on the grid and use it to trace. But basically using poly paint to create the wing vein pattern. And then we are going to extract it so that we can create some geometry for the wing veins, right? Let's just clean it up a little bit and make our lives slightly easier. Okay. All right. So now we can go down to, we can go to masking, and we can go to mask by color, and we can choose mask by intensity. Doesn't look like anything's changed, so I'll go up here to the subtool and turn off poly paint and switch the colors. So now we can see that gray. That's our mask. Let's boost the mask a little bit, right? Go into masking and boost. Just kind of helps get rid of some of this wishy-washiness. If that's not enough, we can go in here, hold Control and Alt, and maybe clean up that. Whoops. Just a little. It doesn't really matter. We're going to extract it. We can always clean that up. So I'm being a little too particular. Let's close this up though. There. Not. Okay. So now what we can do is very classic mask extraction. Under Subtool, way at the bottom, we'll go to Extract. If I just hit the Extract button, it's going to take a few seconds, and we'll see a preview of the extraction. It's probably going to be way too thick. Let's turn off Solo and Transparency. And I'm going to set the thickness to like 0.01 and choose Extract. Sip some beer. That's a little too thick. So let's set this to 0.005. Let's see. Yeah, it'd be nice if Photoshop had a similar silhouette viewer, like ZBrush does. This one of my, when they first introduced that little window, I was like, what's the big deal? But now I find it indispensable. It's really, really helpful. I think this will be okay, because we're gonna do, let's try 0.003. So it's not too thick. So again, I'm hitting the extract button, it's calculating, but what it's showing me is just a preview. There's a really cool Z plugin that makes mesh extraction a bit more precise, and I don't have it installed for this version of ZBrush, unfortunately, but I think it's called Precision Extract or something like that. And it's really cool because you can set the depth in units, and it just works better. But this works fine. So I think that's all right. So I'm going to choose Accept. And when you do a mesh extraction, you're literally extracting the same topology as your source geometry. So here's my mesh extraction. If I turn on Solo and turn on the wireframe, you can kind of see it's got these polygroups, and it's got kind of this grid pattern which is lifted off of the original, and then this straight up down kind of thing. So that's a little bit gross. It's going to be hard to work with. So this is where we're going to do some dynameshing. And you can see it also picked up some of the polygroups there. So, but let's take a look at the wing vein in general. I think it looks all right. It's a bit thick, but that's fine because we're going to be smoothing it out quite a bit. So I'm going to go down here to Dynamesh. And I'm going to, let's choose a resolution here and see how this goes. So that is 584,000 points. If I turn on the viewer, we can kind of see it's not too bad. So I'm going to just do Control W so it's all one polygroup. Let's actually do it a little bit lower. I'm going to set this to, let's say, 320. Control, drag, and release. Smooth, Control, drag, and release. That's a little bit better. So now when I have this, I'm going to start using the smooth brush and the move brush to kind of thin out some of these things so it's not so incredibly thick. Because I'm really thinking about trying to make stuff look elegant here. So I'm going to smooth this out. It's also going to round it a bit because I want these veins to be round. So around this. The problem with this technique is, of course, here on these like wishbone shapes, you can get a little bit too much webbing in between, and it kind of ruins that kind of look of pipes. I want kind of a pipe look. So it's a little back and forth between tugging it with the move brush and smoothing. On dragonfly wings, as you can imagine, this is a much more involved process, and it's hard to keep those cells in between the veins to be more square-like. They tend to round up really quickly, so it just takes a bit more work to make it look the way you want it to. It's something that, you know, I've been trying to perfect my way of doing wing veins over the years. This is the system I'm using now. It works pretty well, but it's far from perfect. I like to add a little bit of what is the word I'm looking for? Just a little bit of oddness to some of the shapes here, so it's not too boring. You can see here in the junctures and kind of thinning them up a little bit. Here I want this to retain some thickness. And there'll be more adjusting, but you can see this is the basic idea. So when I finish kind of smoothing this out and getting this to where I like it, then I'm going to be doing some Z remeshing in order to get a nicer topology. And that takes a little bit of work as well to not lose the shape. You see I like how this tapers out like that. Turn off. You can see how it looks like in relationship to the wing. So it's looking pretty good. I just have the solo button on it because so I can just focus on this right now. But it's good to turn it off every once in a while so you can see what it looks like in relationship to the wing shape. So you're not getting too far away from that wing shape. So you notice I'm doing this, and then what I'll do is once I have this worked out, I'll go back to that wing membrane and I'll start to add some dimension to these cells so that it looks kind of like there's tension and sort of a bubble kind of quality to it, a three-dimensional quality to the wing, so it's not just flat. The last thing you want is just straight up flat wings because it looks stupid. It looks very CG. And the wing membranes are, well, it depends on the insect, obviously. A wasp, they're going to be mostly transparent or semi-transparent. Depends. Some wasps have transparent wings, some do not. But you do want to create kind of a tension and a shape and some detail on there so that it shows up in the specular highlights, even if you have a transparent wing. If you're doing like a fly wing or some other types of insects, including some wasp wings, you want that iridescence to create that kind of rainbow quality, which you can usually get in a shader, like if you're using Redshift or something like that, you can create that kind of look. Whoops. Sorry, that was my arm hitting the plus button on my keyboard. Okay, Okay, so just smoothing, 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 smoothing and shaping. This towards the back of the wing. I want these to be a bit thinner than the ones in the front of the wing. This is why when you Dynamesh, you don't want to make it too dense because it just makes it harder to smooth. You got to work harder to get it thin. I don't use the pinch brush. I'm just using smooth and move at this point. You should combine the two brushes so you have smooth, right? Sorry, I know I'm going quiet here. I don't want these to be too thick here, wherever there's a junction. Something a little bit more like this. Whoops, that looks good. You can always re-Dynamesh every few seconds. Gonna bake in that shape. It's a little too thin, so let's get the inflate brush back here. Inflate. There we go. So yeah, species of insects, even within the same order, are going to have different wing veins. It's one of the identifiers of particular species. So if you're doing something for a scientist, make sure that you have the wing veining correct, or you will hear about it. Oh no, Ash Wagers is watching me? How you doing, Ash? Long time no see. We should hang out again at some point. I worked with Ash at Prologue Films way back in the day. We worked on many, many entertaining projects together. Always a fun guy to work with. All right. I miss you too, Ash. I see you on social media every once in a while. I'm not on Facebook anymore. I gave up on Facebook. So I'm on Instagram. So if you want to connect, my Instagram is bloopatone01. Feel free to follow me. Thanks for allowing me to give a plug there. But that's where I'm mostly active on social media. And I'm on LinkedIn as well. As I actually started using it again for the first time in years because it actually did finally got cool. LinkedIn was really lame for a really long time. Sorry, LinkedIn, but you know it's true. But now they're good. They're kind of like Facebook with a purpose, you know. It's a little bubbly here, but when we ZBrush, it'll fix it. Or I'll be able to fix it when I ZBrush. So I'm not going to obsess about it too much. Go, la, 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 la la. It's fascinating stuff. This whole area right here I'm reserving for sculpting the insect or the wing muscles. So I just want to have a big block of something to mess with there. And I'll figure out what I'm going to do, but it'll probably be more creative license than I do on most of the rest of the bug. I'm going to make something that looks cool and believable, but not as confident about the actual shapes as I am on other parts of the insect. And then, you know, also this entire technique I'm going to repeat for the hind wings as well. If I don't get to it tonight, I'll do it offline, but it's the exact same technique. I'll do it offline and then do like a time lapse or something like that. Just because it's repeating basically the exact same ideas here that I'm doing right now. Just a different design, you know. So let's see if I get to that tonight. I might, because I'm almost to a point where I'm okay with this. So I'm going to just inflate this up a little bit to give it a little bit of thickness. Switch to the old blue material. Do another redynamesh, sorry. Okay, let's take a look at this. So, I think that looks pretty good, at least for now. It's basically hitting all the things that I want to hit. I might do this though a little bit. I think this needs a little bit more visual interest. Okay, let's save. Save next. If you're doing a projection, which I think is what you mean by doing a Z-wrap, you need to have, if you're doing project all, you need to have at least the subtool, the selected subtool visible, and then whatever your target is, you need to have your target selected and anything you're projecting from also visible. So in other words, if I'm projecting from this polymesh and I'm choosing under project all or project all, this one right here, which is what you mean by wrap or Z-wrap. I don't know exactly what Z-wrap is, but make sure that you have the target selected and anything you're projecting from visible. In other words, has these eyeball icons. So if I project from, like, okay, so here's a good example. Let's just show you. So here's my wing membrane. Let's turn on solo. Here's my wing membrane. All right. Let's say that I might want to project this extraction onto the wing membrane. So when I have my wing membrane selected, I want to have my extract visible. I'll turn off solo so you can see. Everything else is hidden. Oh, sorry, gotta hide these as well. Okay, now everything else is hidden. So it's just going to be projecting from this onto this. Still got a thorax piece visible. There we go. It's projecting this onto the selected subtool. And if you look in the projection settings, you want to pay attention to your distance here. That's how far it's going to look in order to do the projection. So if I do project all, it's going to take a few seconds. You can have the solo button on for projection, but for the purposes of making this nice and clear, not making it too complicated, I'm going to leave solo alone. Now if I do turn on solo, you can see how it's projected that wing vein pattern onto the wing membrane, which is a useful technique when dissecting insect wings, because sometimes you can use that as a basis for sculpting sort of the cells of the wing, if that makes sense. I'm going to undo that and go back to my wing veins. And let's take a look at Z remeshing. Okay, so this might be a little bit tricky. First of all, let's store this place in undo history so we can project from that. So in that case, we'll be using project history and not project all. So I'm going to control click on that undo history marker, and I'm going to switch over to the white material so it's easier to see the topology. Let's just turn on solo. So let's go in here and choose Z remesh, which is under geometry, Z remesh, and let's set it all the way up to 100,000 adaptive, and also let's make sure that symmetry is on, and hit Z remesh. Don't see any errors. So here's our results. So we want to check the end pieces here where things get thin. When you're doing Z remesh, sometimes where that might be where you get errors, things kind of fall apart a little bit. So I'm going to go, I have the inflate brush here. I'm going to smooth and just inflate just a little bit, so when I do another Z remesh, I don't lose too much geometry. And also any places that look super thin, because this will be easy enough to sculpt that thinness back in anyway. So, but I want to make sure like this is a good example of Z remesh kind of getting some yucky geometry here. Let's just thin that out a little bit. That's pretty gross. So in this case, what I don't like that, so I'm going to do Control Shift drag over here, and actually Control Shift drag, hold the Alt key to hide that, and I'll do modify topology, delete hidden to get rid of that nastiness, and I can also do like a close holes here just to close that up. And now when I do another Z remesh, I have a tip there that's better than that ugliness. Let's see over here how this looks. That's not too bad. I'm going to smooth it and inflate a little bit just to help Z remesh figure out what it needs to do. And then let's take a look at any parts that look super thin. Like this is a little too thin. Not too thin for the design, but Z remesh is going to struggle with it a little bit. You know, I've done hand topology of insect veins before, where you could use extrude edge and just literally kind of like a quad draw for the veins, and then extrude the whole vein. That works too. It also helps to create a nice topology, but I find that in many cases Z remesh these days does the job I need it to do, because that takes a lot longer. And since this is more of a concept thing, I'm kind of making things up. Just, you know, you can test many different methods and find the one that works best for you in any particular situation. Okay, so I fattened it up a little bit. So let's do a Z remesh now, and I'm going to set this to half, turn off adaptive, and do half. And let's take a look here. So we're getting down a little bit lower, 118,000. These webbing areas are going to get a little tricky here. Let's smooth that. We're going to have to do some fixing on those again as we lower it, but these seem okay. Maybe I'll fatten them up with the inflate brush just a little bit so I don't lose them too much. The next is around the Z remesh. So you can see I'm just kind of doing one Z remesh after another to see how low I can get without losing the shape. If I can get the wing veins down to like below 24,000, believe it or not, that you can still rig and animate that. If I can get it even lower, that's even better. I mean, you could go in here with the Z modeler brush and start deleting edges too. You can kind of do that manually if you really want to have control over it. You know, the best way to get control is do a hand retopology, but I'm not going to do that because it takes too long, and I think I can use ZBrush to get the results that I want just by messing with it a few times. I think a lot of CG artists were kind of trained to like hit a button, and if it doesn't work, we assume that the software just doesn't do it. In ZBrush, sometimes it's a matter of like jiggling it, redoing something over and over again until you can get it to work the way you want it to. And if you're persistent, usually you can find a method or a combination of methods that will give you the result you need. Especially true when you're preparing something for print, that I've found, because I'm doing some fairly complex models that I need to print out, whether it's like jewelry or something like that, or insect-based jewelry. And I find that it's like you just got to keep trying until you get what you want. You can't expect to just hit something and have it work, because it rarely works in the first time the way that you want it to. You're going to test things out. Okay, so I'm saying the same thing over and over again. That's fine. Let's do a ZBrush, see what happens. Now we're down to 63,000, and we still have our shapes here. So you can see I'm really paying a lot of attention to these tips. You can always turn off the solo button. And also, if I want to see what my original design looks like, and turn polypaint back on my wing membrane. So you can see we haven't crept too far from the original design. I can use the move brush to kind of maybe stretch this out a little bit. All right, let's see if we do another time. Let's see how far we get. ZBrush using the half setting. This is where we're going to start to lose detail. Now we're down to 32,000. So this might be as low as we can go on here without losing these bits down here. That's not too bad. Just inflating a little bit down here, over here. The advantage of using this method is it helps to get rid of some of the wobbles. You just have to be careful, because if I start smoothing right here, I get this, and that's something I don't want. That does not look like insects. That looks a little too designy. But if you're doing an alien insect, maybe it's cool. I think, like, if I inflate this and do another ZBrush, I think I'm going to lose too much of this geometry. Right there, that's kind of nasty. So, let's see. Let's just see what happens. It's not too bad. Now we're down to 17,000, so that's definitely below 24,000, which I think is kind of a usable. Lost a little, shrunk a little bit, but I can bring it back. Right? And then what you could do, it depends on how nitpicky you're going to be, but what you could do at this point is go in here with Z Modeler, and if you really wanted to, you could set like the edge action to delete, right? And then set this to edge loop complete, and then go in here and like start deleting edge loops. If you really wanted to reduce that polygon count, it takes a few minutes to do, but it does work pretty well. I'm not going to do that though. I'm going to keep this fairly evenly spaced because I'm still kind of sculpting it. But it's something you could do. And then you could use Z Modeler to go down here, and like if you have real serious problems in these pointy areas, you could use it to fix that. But I'm going to stick to the move brush, and I'm going to subdivide this a few times so that we have more geometry to work with. Let's do subdivide it up to like 1.1 million. I think that's fine. Let's save. I'm going to save next. And then go in here and start to use the move brush. It's these little wishbone areas that I want to kind of touch up. So they don't get too webby. And then use the smooth brush to kind of thin these areas out right here. Now I have the advantage that I can step down using Shift D, and that makes it a little bit faster to thin parts out to make it look a bit more elegant. All right, I can thin this out. Let's turn off solo, and I'll go back to my subtools and turn off polypaint there, so we can just focus on this. And use the move brush to kind of poke it back up to that leading edge. You will want to add some detailed noise to this, whether it's like surface noise or just something, so that it looks more organic. Again, it's a question of, you know, if you're rendering this like in another program, you're using like Redshift or something like that, or even Redshift for ZBrush, having a little bit of texture, noise on this, and especially this visible and the specular channel, is really important for making it look organic. If you don't have that, if it's just straight up smooth, it's going to look CG. And somebody's going to say, you made that with AI. I'm like, okay, whatever. What we have is you're gonna pretty soon, if you don't have it already, is AI bots that accuse you of you doing everything with AI. It's like for many years, of course, anytime you posted a photo, people would say, you did that with Photoshop. It was something really strange or hard to believe, even if it was real. Now everybody's just changed it out. They swapped out Photoshop for AI. Now they're like, you've done everything with AI. It's like, all right, whatever. I have noticed a lot of the people I see doing AI online, posting images. It's all tanks and guns and stuff blowing up and missiles flying around. I'm like, guys, not to sound like a hippie, but maybe use your tools to create something that celebrates something other than destruction. I mean, most of my art is usually about celebrating the diversity of life. Of course, if you're modeling ants are pretty vicious in the way that they wage war, so. And nature itself is actually pretty vicious, so I guess it's all the same in the end. But still, we got enough missiles and bombs going on in the real world. I don't necessarily need to give AI any other ideas, you know. I guess it's too late for that, huh? Okay. While that's auto-saving, I'll pontificate pointlessly some more. I've been out of ZBrush since 2014 and come back into it. Currently working on an underpowered system with the old Gen XP pen. Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed the live streams. Yeah, boy, I lost change since 2014. What was going on in 2014? Yeah, they've added a lot of stuff. What I would recommend if you're getting back into ZBrush is go back and watch the previous, each year that they do an update, watch the recap. So watch the 2023 recap with Paul Cabri and Ian Robinson and Louis Tucci, and just go back and watch some of those recaps from previous years. whenever they introduce new features. In fact, what I do is go back to 2014 and then just go chronologically on YouTube, watch each of the recaps, because that's the best way to get a handle on what the new features are when they announce them, because they're all additive. I mean, the advantage that I have is I've been using ZBrush since 2004, and I've also been in many beta programs, beta testing new versions of ZBrush. So I've had the advantage of learning the new features as they are introduced. And it's just because I'm a ZBrush artist. I mean, you could say, like, I'm the exact same way. Like, I haven't really used Houdini much in the past few years, so I don't have any idea what the new features are like. But I have used it in the past. So if I was going to get into Houdini now, I'd had to catch up a lot on the new features. So it's just the software package, our package of choice or whatever. But I have had the advantage of having each of the new features introduced, a few at a time, as opposed to trying to learn, 40 or 50 new features overnight, which is overwhelming. The other thing, of course, is even as they add new features, they change some of the older ones. So some of the things that you might be familiar with from using ZBrush in 2014 have changed a lot since then. And sometimes it's interesting is that old features that never seem to be very useful at all suddenly become really, really useful. Like, I think the best example is the snake hook brush. Like, the snake hook brush has been part of ZBrush for the longest time, but it was always pretty much completely worthless until they introduced Sculptress. And it was completely worthless before they had Dynamesh, because you were just stretching your geometry all over the place. It really started out as a 2.5D brush that was adapted for 3D. But once they introduced Sculptress, now all of a sudden the snake hook brush is incredibly useful because it works great with Sculptress. So that's a good example. There's also some new features in the latest version of ZBrush that I haven't used at all that actually take advantage of the 2.5D brushes that nobody ever uses. So you can kind of drop your model to the canvas now, just like you used to with Projection Master, and use the 2.5D brushes and then pick your model up again as a 3D model, and so you take advantage of those brushes. So I've seen a demo on this, but I haven't actually used that feature much at all yet because it's pretty new, and it's just, I have my own working style, as we all do, and sometimes it's hard to adapt a new tool to your familiar working style. So I'm going in here, I'm thickening up this vein here on the outer edge, and I'm going to thicken this one up too. In fact, I think this one on the outer edge should be a bit thinner, and this one should be a bit thicker based on the reference that I'm looking at. Right, so just doing that so you can have this kind of strong bit of support. There's usually kind of like a area right here where you get a thicker bit. It's almost like an inflection point where you have some support there on a lot of insect wings, especially Hymenoptera. At least I've noticed. Yeah, I've been using ZBrush for a long time. It's my favorite program. I've been using Maya since 1998, but Maya is Maya. I wouldn't say it's my favorite program, but it's a way to make a living. But ZBrush is my favorite because I actually enjoy using it. And I am, before you ask, yes, I am learning Blender. But Blender for me is more of a Maya alternative, although the sculpting tools in Blender are okay. I just find that ZBrush has more of an artistic feel to the sculpting brushes, and I feel like I get more control over them. So for sculpting, I much prefer ZBrush. Okay. So there's our wing veins for right now. Just smoothing out some of the wobbles here. And, as I start to detail these things, like what I'll do is I'm going to switch over to the wing membrane just to shake it up a little bit because I got about 20 minutes left. But what I would do is go in here with let's say the inflate brush and start to shape some muscles using various different brushes, kind of create kind of something that looks interesting, like there's actual structure here. And you can do this with a variety of brushes. Let's just do this really quickly for now. So you see how I'm making it look a bit more organic and interesting. And don't forget there's the other side that I got to do as well. But I'm just kind of demonstrating really quickly how to create some muscle-like anatomy here without, again, I don't know what I'm doing in terms of how correct this is, so take this with a grain of salt. This is straight up creature design and not necessarily scientific visualization. The material is called Dirty Blue, M-A-H, Dirty Blue. You can get it in the ZBrush matte cap library if you can find it online. So we talked about it in the previous live streams. It's a nice material because it shows detail really well, but it's also, the blue color doesn't wear out the eyes as fast as, say, the red wax material kind of burns out your eyes, I think. The red wax material also has that kind of fake subsurface scattering kind of quality, which looks neat, but also makes it harder to see details and the actual depth of the details. So I find this is a nice material that is easy on the eyes as you work. Because I will work for hours and hours and hours on end in ZBrush. And you'll notice that every once in a while I'll switch over to that white material. I used to sculpt all the time in the gray, basic gray material, but that kind of, I don't know, it's kind of depressing as materials go. So every once in a while I'll switch to the Skin Shade 4 material, which is flat white. I do that when I'm trying to look at the topology and see the arrangement of the polygons more clearly, or if I'm doing like poly paint. But for regular sculpting, when I want to see the details, this is my favorite material to use. And it was Tomas Wittelsbach who kind of turned me on to this particular material. That's probably overdid it right there, but I'm going to save this right here. And let's talk about making the wing a bit more interesting. Yeah, let me type the name of the material into the chat. Okay, so now for the wing membrane itself, we want to give it some dimensionality. So I'll alt-click on it to switch over here. And let me see, we got 3 million. I think that's plenty. So I'm going to switch over to, let's say, clay tubes and lower my Z intensity. And I'm just going to start by kind of sculpting. Let's see if that's too low. I think I still have a mask on there. Hello. Is this working? Oh, there we go. If you're working on it, this is something I've noticed. So here's a tip. Pay attention, because this is going to save you hours of mystery. If you're working on a surface, right, a single-sided surface, and everything you're doing with a brush has no effect, it's like I'm hitting it with the clay tubes brush, I'll show Z intensity 100, nothing happening. It's going crazy. If you're using a single-sided surface, go down to display properties and turn off double, and you'll notice that if I'm sculpting on the inside of the surface, then the brush is having no effect, even when double is on, because double is just giving you a visualization of the backside of the polygons. Try flipping it around and then see what happens. Now it's working. So it's easy, especially working on a surface like this, to forget which side you're looking at. So I just flipped it around. So now I'm going to use like clay tubes, and I'm going very sketchy and very loose, and I'm just kind of like alternating between clay tubes and smooth to kind of create that look of like a bulge in the cell. And you could also go in here and kind of sculpt a grain to kind of imply a certain amount of tension. Another good brush for that would be like the SK cloth brush, right? Just drawing some lines. This is a little bit over exaggerated, but I just want to create the look of tension between the wing veins. That's a little bit too much. Another good one for this is the Damon Standard brush. So you can go in here and, you know, and I even like the look of that even better. And then I'll hit it with a smooth brush just to make it a bit more subtle, you know. And then this is the kind of stuff that's going to show up in the specular highlights when you render it. So maybe what I'll first do is use that clay tubes brush and start to create that bulge in the cell. If you don't have any texture on the wings, they're going to look stupid. They're going to look very plastic and very artificial and CG. That kind of messy kind of quality to it. And like, if you know, at the beginning of this session, I was showing the Japanese hornet. And you see, I had little dots all over the wing membrane itself. The wing membrane will often have tiny hairs growing out of it. This is, again, this is for sensing the environment, among other things. But you want to create those little dots on the surface of the wing to where the hairs might be popping out of, you know. Just something so that when the light hits it, you see the actual surface and it's not just a big old reflection of the light source. Another thing you can do is take like the SK cloth brush and maybe like create a bit of an indentation. That's a bit too much. This is when the design starts to come alive a bit more, you know. Making these kinds of details right here really adds to the realism. It's kind of like my favorite part when the design starts to just sing, you know. That's also my favorite part. Is, you know, I'm a detail junkie, so my favorite part is going to be when I'm actually creating fine detail on the surface, and also poly paint. This is a little lumpy on the wing veins right here, but I'll fix that when I get a chance. So main reason why I want to have my wing veins to have subdivisions, because it's always easier to remove that lumpiness by going to a lower subdivision level and smoothing it out. Okay, let's do this over here. Yeah, I'm using a Cintiq. I've been using Cintiqs for years. I can't live without them. I know some artists, especially Photoshop artists, actually prefer to use a tablet for some reason. They like to look at the screen but not see their. Well, for some reason, at least my friend, good friend that Ash Wagers knows, Chris Sanchez, who's a really amazing artist and designer. He never liked to use the Cintiq because he always felt like the pen got in the way of his lines, which I could see if you're doing a lot of Photoshop painting, that might be a problem. For ZBrush, I really prefer using a Cintiq. I haven't spoken to Chris Sanchez in a long time, but what a great guy. Amazing designer. Really nice guy. You never know from talking to him how many amazing things he's done in his career. I think he was one of the designers of the Game of Thrones intro, and that's a pretty famous intro. I knew him back at Prologue Films, just like me and Ash Wager. We always just sit next to each other and suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And a lot of late nights. I would say if you're looking into getting a Cintiq tablet, there's like another company that does, a competing company that does really nice tablets. They're actually a lot of ex-Wacom people, so they know what they're doing. And of course, I can't remember the name of their company, but it's a really good one. Anybody remember? I should have the card around here somewhere. Hold on a second. Give me 2 seconds. I can figure out what it is, because I think they're really cool. Hold on, I'm still here. I haven't left yet. Okay, it is. Hold on a second. This is going to be worth it, trust me. So, one, take a look at Zence Labs pen display. It's a lot like a Cintiq. I used this at the Z Summit and I really liked it a lot. So I'm doing a plug for these guys as an alternative to a Cintiq. Price-wise, very competitive. I like this little controller because you can position it everywhere and it's very programmable, so that works really well. But I like the feel of the tablet as well. So I would say take a look if you get a chance to try one out. It's an alternative to a Cintiq. It's a good one, but I love Cintiqs too, so I'm going to recommend both. Zence Labs is I know I'm not pronouncing that right. I haven't tried the other two ones that you mentioned, XP Pen or Huion. Why can't they make these things easier to pronounce? Canvas. Oh, that's kind of cool. I'll have to check that out too. Yeah, I guess it's like the Cintiq no longer, I guess, has a monopoly on their technology, so there's a lot of competing companies that have popped up. Yeah, it's interesting. The argument tricks my mind. Doesn't your hand stay on in the way when you do traditional art? Yeah, well, that's what I think too. I'm like, I'll take that, Cintiq drivers are a headache. I 100% agree with that. Absolutely, they're a headache. I am always having to restart my drivers. Weird stuff is always happening. It always feels haunted. Sorry, Wacom, but you're driving me crazy with your drivers, And I'm not crazy about the button setup on the actual Cintiq itself. Sorry, we're doing a little Cintiq bashing session tonight. But hey, man, it's capitalism, man. Competitiveness. Okay, so I'm going to kind of finish this up tonight. Let's take a look at what I have so far. I'm gonna use this SK cloth brush to just kind of do this. So our wing veins. Okay, so let's take a look at the status quo. Lost my head. There's a head. That's kind of what our wings look like so far. It's not too bad. Like I said, the hind wing is going to be very similar workflow. I'm going to paint on this wing vein based on my reference, kind of try and make it match, you know, in terms of the overall quality of it, and then paint that on there, do a mesh extraction, Dynamesh, shape it a bit, ZBrush, shape it some more, and then start to sculpt the wing membrane itself to create these kinds of three-dimensional cells. So what I might do is do that really quickly offline, record a time lapse, and then I'll play that next week, next Wednesday at 7:30 Pacific time. I will be here, and we'll talk more about the wings, how I approach the muscles, the other connections here, and we'll get into the next stage for this model. Is my favorite stage. Is we're going to do some refinement of the shapes to really make things kind of a little bit more congruous, for lack of a better term, and then we're going to get into fine detailing where the real super heavy detail comes into play, and we really start to make this thing look realistic. But I do like the way that it's looking now. I'm very happy with this overall design. I like the eye shape and the head, and I like how a lot of the shapes of the body have been derived from that original head shape. That sort of diamond, triangular quality creeps in other parts. I'm going to have to address this, I think, a bit right here, because we'll see. We'll see if I can come up with some ways. You know, there's ways to test animation in ZBrush using the timeline, so I might use that as a way to see if I can get away with this, because I like this. It looks like the hind wings are kind of avoiding them, but we'll talk about that next time. Maybe come up with a better pose. I'd like to work more on the legs. I'm not crazy about the way the legs look at the moment. They're okay in terms of the anatomy, but there's something a little bit disappointing with the legs compared to the rest of the design. The rest of the design is very unique and also convincing, but the legs are just, there's something about them that's leaving me, I don't know, it's missing something. So I'm gonna work on the legs a little bit more, but fine detailing is going to be the next step. And then after that, we do fine detailing, I get into poly painting, and then after poly painting, you know, prepare for whatever the next stage is. So what I like to do eventually, and my goal in this series, is once I have this finished and poly painted, I'm going to do some rendering in Redshift within ZBrush, as opposed to leaving and going to Maya or another program. I'm going to try and do everything in ZBrush and see if I can render some nice concept frames within ZBrush, even create a little bit of an environment or something. I have a few ideas in mind, so that'll be fun to play with. Because Redshift in ZBrush is really nice because it allows you to do some nice concept renders, which is a great way to get approval from an art director without having to prep everything and send it to another program. The downside of using Redshift and ZBrush is it's not quite as powerful as you would get in Maya or Cinema 4D, because you don't have access to shader networks and all that kind of stuff. But you can still get some really nice renders out of it that blow away anything you could do in ZBrush before. So we'll talk about that in the coming weeks. But here's where we're at right now. I want to thank everybody for hanging out with me, and I hope you got some cool ideas that you can use in your own models, whether they're bugs or otherwise. Let me see. Can you show the silhouette again? I'm going to address a few questions here before I finish. So here is the silhouette compared to the model, and if I turn off the wing membrane visibility, you can actually see the silhouette of the veins, which is kind of nice. How do you know when to call a project done? One way is to have a deadline from a client. That's always a good way. Season premieres next week. Gotta have it done. But as a personal project, I've done it enough times that I know that. Let me put it this way: there is a certain threshold when you realize that the more sculpting you're doing, you're not adding anything more to the design. You're just kind of circling or going around in circles. When I feel myself doing that, that's when I kind of declare it done. When I feel like there's nothing else that I'm not moving anything forwards, I'm just fiddling, that's usually a good sign that it's done. I usually know after doing so many bugs, I mean, you've seen how many bug models I did at the beginning of this session. That's just a small sampling of the number of insect models I've done over the years. So now I have a sense of what's necessary in order to get the kind of finished end result that I need. You know, I'll do as much as I can in ZBrush if I'm going to render in another program, and then I'll do more in Substance and then bring it into Maya. But I do have a system now that I've worked out over the years for bringing a model to completion, or what I would call completion. So that's the best way I can answer it. All right, guys, I will see you next week. You can always invent artificial deadlines, by the way. That's another good way to do it. All right, guys, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time, next Wednesday at 7:30 Pacific time.